Okay. I'm amazed that all of you stayed around. I really am. I like to wander, so I'm just going to stand up here. So this was a really tricky presentation to put together because you're a very diverse crowd of people. Like, how many people have healthcare backgrounds or work in healthcare? Yeah. And then how many people are in engineering and computer science? And then how many people are in social sciences? Yeah, so like you're like all over the place. Like, you should like sit down and like, greet your neighbor and just like have a beer with them, or wine, or water, whatever you want. So I'm going to try and give you some illustrations of the things that we work on and what I think the future of AI looks like in various ways. Try to keep you entertained on this. One disclosure I wanted to offer. So I have research funding from Intuit. Okay, and you might be asking, why does a guy who's a professor in a school of medicine have funding from a company that builds TurboTax? And so you're gonna see why that is in a moment, but I just wanted to recognize this. Okay, so paper we published very beginning of last year that you look back on it and you're just like, it's like, duh, like like everybody should do this. This was like right when ChatGPT came out. And we got really curious just about like what these large language models were capable of doing, right? And so we were really curious about this notion of drug repositioning. And so there aren't a lot of great drugs that are out there for managing Alzheimer's, right? And part of this is like you're gonna still need to do more discovery on the biological level to try to figure out what types of molecules we need for intervention. But we were curious to see what these language models would reason about. And so we went back to ChatGPT and we said, hey, can you give us like 20 drugs that are not specifically designated for treating Alzheimer's, which there weren't many, right? And what you think might be useful for treating Alzheimer's. Okay, so this is like a really just standard thing. So you know that this is a probabilistic reasoner, so we asked it the same question like about 10 times. And then this is where like we had the access to like lots of data to try to see if what the recommendations were in alignment with what the data might suggest. So we went back to 2 different cohorts. One was we've got access to all the electronic medical records at Vanderbilt over the years. It's about 3 million medical records now. And so we wanted to look at, it's basically like a time to live or a time until event model. So like, if an individual took this drug that ChatGPT had suggested, what was the chance that they were going to develop dementia within a certain amount of time? And so then we said, okay, well, Vanderbilt's a special place. I like it, I work there. But we then also went over to the All of Us research program. And so if you're not familiar with the All of Us research program, it's this multi-billion-dollar escapade that the federal government has been working on to build a cohort of 1 million people's medical records and genomic data and mobile computing data. And so I've helped run this group for a while. And so we said, okay, well, we're gonna do this in both environments, and we're gonna run a meta-analysis to see if the findings are meaningful. All right, so here's what came out. So I realized earlier today when I was standing in the back of the room, like watching one of the presentations, I was like, oh no, I've got really tiny font. Okay, so the words don't matter, all right? That just sounds funny, but the words don't matter here. So what I want to show you is like blue is going to be a hazard analysis for Vanderbilt's data. Red is going to be a hazard analysis for all of us data, and then the gray is going to be the meta-analysis. What you want to see are things that are below 1, which will suggest that the drug is having some type of a correlative protective effect. Notice I say correlative, right? We can't say it's causal, but some type of a protective effect with respect to Alzheimer's. And so these were the drugs that were recommended by ChatGPT. So you've got lithium, rapamycin, candesartan, okay, which is really intriguing, right? That's like an anti-norepinephrine. So, gotta stop doing that. Okay, so couple things, you'll notice that the error bars are wide, right? So not much there, and we were only picking up on things that showed up at Vanderbilt. We step up into another drug and we start to see that things are starting to trend a little bit in the right direction, right? And then we pick up simvastatin and minocycline. Simvastatin, right? You know, it's like you got a statin in there. Like how many, I'm not gonna ask how many people are on statins, but you'll notice like this is where we're starting to get we're getting statistical significance, all right? And it's hitting relatively well on simvastatin, but it's like borderline. Minocycline hit, but it only hit at Vanderbilt. All right, then we had the two big ones that hit. One was losartan, okay, again, an antihypertensive. And losartan hit well in Vanderbilt, didn't hit as well in all of us, but on the meta-analysis, it hit really well. But then we get the wonder drug, metformin, okay? And metformin, you know, is basically a drug for managing type 2 diabetes and other types of issues. But we were like, whoa, there's really something here. Now, we can't tell you exactly what is there, but this is what started a whole new series of investigations into associations between drugs and repurposing for dementia and Alzheimer's. And we were like, wow, that's what large language models can do? That's really, really, really intriguing. This is like right out of the box. This was zero shot, right? But what was noticeable about it was that it was hypothesis generating for us in a virtual sense, and then we went back to the actual data on patients so that we could verify it, and now we've got to go start doing the trials. Okay, so that's what we could do with out of the box for hypothesis generation for biomedical discovery, right? We then said, you know, one of the bigger challenges that we're running into is that, okay, so you can define something like Alzheimer's. You can define it. Now the question is, how easy is it to find various types of phenotypes within the medical record? Now, if you don't work in this space, I will tell you, it's not as simple as you think it is, because medical records are a hodgepodge of different documentation strategies. And so there's been various ways in which people have come up with these phenotyping algorithms to try to like whack the medical record into submission to make it AI ready, okay? And it takes a very long time, right? So you gotta get like a lot of domain experts together and they've gotta like deliberate on what does like, you know, like pick your favorite like type 2 diabetes mean. You would think it'd be easy to define type 2 diabetes, but when you see a medical record and it says that the patient's a type 2 diabetic and then 2 weeks later it's documenting that they're a type 1 diabetic, things happen. So what we did was this was also last year, we were really curious about whether or not the large language models could just deliver to us, again, zero shot right out of the box. Could it tell us what factors we would want to look for within the electronic medical record to define 3 types of very different phenotypes? We were interested in type 2 diabetes, dementia, and hypothyroidism. Very different, okay? So we then took back what it had recommended, and it said, like, here's the diagnosis code you should look for, here are the treatment codes or the procedure codes, here's the meds you would want to look for. And we said, hey, clinical experts who normally do this, can you tell us whether or not ChatGPT or Claude or Bard are doing the right thing? Notice I used Bard, Gemini wasn't out yet. And so what you can see was that at the time, and I presented this to a couple friends at Google, I said, look, you guys at Google are doing a horrible job, Bard doesn't work. OpenAI, things were trending in the right direction. So GPT 3.5 doing well, GPT 4 doing even better. So this was just a 3-point Likert scale, all right? So 3 would have been the top, and GPT 4 was doing pretty well, all right? It depended on the phenotype though, and this is where things are gonna start getting really interesting. So you can see it wasn't as good for dementia as it was for hypothyroidism. So then we went back to, again, we took data that we had, but we took data from a much larger NIH network, which is called the Electronic Medical Records and Genomics Network. It's been around for about 15 years. And we took these 3 different cohorts and we checked to see how well this phenotyping algorithm was representing people who did have things like hypothyroidism, those are our cases, versus those who were in the controls, because we had representations, we asked the LLM for representations of both. All right, here's the findings. So recall on the right, on the bottom. So you want high recall, and you want to have a low false positive rate, right? So we want to be down in that bottom right-hand corner, all right? Now, what you can see is blue is GPT 3.5. So things got better between 3.5 and 4 with dementia and hypothyroidism. It got better with T2D, but you'll notice that the system had some problems with T2D, okay? So this is one of those situations where I'm like, it has potential, but it's not necessarily always ready to go right out of the box. But it's got potential. But this stuff, like we're talking about hundreds of hours of manpower of like just really complex clinical reasoning that somehow this LLM was able to do out of the box. We got excited. So those are a couple illustrations of just like, again, I'm not doing any fancy AI here. We were just like right at the forefront when this was coming out. What we're starting to see is that in the healthcare space is that not just facilitate biomedical discovery, but also try to facilitate clinical care, right? And so we don't have clinical co-pilots yet, but what we do have are systems that are assisting in workflow, right? And so as you can see, you can go to something like ChatGPT and you say, hey, I've got like this 51-year-old guy, he's gonna be discharged because he had like a stent put in and we put him on warfarin. Could you generate a list of things that he needs to be aware of at discharge, right? And that's like typical of like, this is like ChatGPT's bread and butter, right? So it's like, okay, well, here's what you need to be aware of with meds, blood testing, wound care activity, goes on and on and on. And so then, as you're all probably aware, you can go back to ChatGPT and say, hey, could you summarize that? Because there's no way this guy's gonna read all that, right? And it can be like, oh yeah, sure, here's a really simple set of instructions. Great, okay? We're super excited about this. These are the things that you should be no-brainer putting into clinical workflow. But then you gotta kind of ask this question, right? So it's like, hey, ChatGPT, can I trust you? First of all, you have to ask the question, does it understand what the word trust means? And we'll come back to that in a second. But can I trust you? I want to show you what ChatGPT said. So ChatGPT comes back, and I love this. It's like, that's a great question. So how many people have heard of value alignment? If you haven't heard of value alignment, basically what's happening here is ChatGPT is stroking my ego, okay? And it's stroking my ego because it wants me to be involved with it, right? It's like, that's a great question. And honestly, a wise one. Okay, so you should always think carefully about the advice you get, especially when it comes to health. Here's the real answer. I can give you clear, thoughtful, and medically informed guidance, but I'm not a substitute for your healthcare team. That's good, right? But then what it says is, I provide solid, widely acceptable medical knowledge, but your clinicians will have a better understanding and will have the final say. Okay, so read all this, and basically it says, I can be of assistance to you, I can help. Now, what I want you to recognize is that's what it said last week. This is what it said 4 years ago, okay? 4 years ago, it says, look, I'm an AI language model. I don't have personal biases or motivations, but here's what I really like. It says, my responses are based solely on the information and data that I have been trained on. It's important to remember that I'm not infallible. You notice the language difference, right? So today, it's sounding really, really confident in stroking my ego, right? And 4 years ago, it was like, I'm a bot. Okay, so this is one of these situations where we're watching the evolution and we're watching how reinforcement learning is actually changing the way that these LLMs are representing themselves to the end user. Okay, again, I haven't addressed the trust issue. I just want you to recognize that the way these things are reasoning and communicating is changing. So I think a lot about this notion of responsible computing. And what I've shown you is that we're talking about models, right? We're building bigger and better models and we're putting them into practice and we're hoping that people use them. But in reality, what we're really talking about is machine learning, right? Most of the stuff we're doing is not AI in a very broad sense. We're talking about data-driven machine learning. And so we have to ask questions about like, where's this data coming from? Because remember, ChatGPT just told me, don't trust me, trust the data that I was based upon. But if you ask ChatGPT, what data were you based upon? It kind of goes, I'm not going to tell you that. All right, so in the healthcare space though, this is where things get really interesting because the way in which you get data is that you have to ask people for data. And the reason why I'm showing you this process is that in reality, what we've been talking about in terms of responsible computing is putting checkpoints in and saying, well, do we have a good model? Do we have good data? And you can think of this as like a feedback mechanism. If you pass the checks, you keep going forward, you build the system, you put it out into the world. But if you fail the checks, you're gonna have to go back and say, hey, data's not good enough. The model wasn't working the way I expected it to. Go get better data, whatever that means. So in my world, I also want to point out that this is only half of the equation. This is what happens from like a research perspective that says, I want to build a new model. I want to see if this is actually going to be helpful. But when you live in the healthcare space, you then flip it around and say, I now actually have to use this thing. And this is what we were seeing before, which is first, I need to figure out if the knowledge that comes out of it is correct. I need to test that. More importantly, I need to figure out if it's actionable. Because if it's not actionable and it just tells me something, it's not necessarily going to be useful. And then the biggest issue is I need to ask questions about whether or not it's generalizable. Okay? Because if it works at my institution only, that means that we're going to be stuck with models that work at each institution and have to be trained there. So I want to talk a little bit about this life cycle and talk about how responsibility can be baked into it, but you have to be careful in how you do it. You have to be deliberate at different points, because the way you do it depends on where you are. Okay, so first I want to talk about this notion of trust in a different way than I talked about before. This is but I'm going to show you how you break trust. So a couple things to keep in mind is that this notion of transparency, all right? So what you may or may not have heard of, and probably most of you have never heard of this, is this database called MarketScan. Anybody ever heard of MarketScan? One person. You get a gold star for the day. Do you want a gold star? Okay. So what happens here is that MarketScan is this large repository of most insurance claims that happened in the United States. Okay? It's been around for several decades. IBM bought it. It's basically a de-identified repository of most of the medical claims. And they recently spun it off to a company called Meritive, but they licensed this. And most people have no idea that this is actually licensable, right? Okay, now, this is not a trust issue yet. This is just a, say what, right? How did this happen? So that's one illustration of where things are a little questionable. Now, here's the other one. Has anybody ever heard of Project Nightingale? Yeah, okay, one person, two people. So, cautionary tale for everybody. So there's this little company called Google that they ended up in a partnership with Accenture Health, which is one of the largest healthcare organizations in this country. They have about 60 million patients that they cover. Google basically was building AI-driven tools for Accenture. There was an engineer at Google who said, hey, world, they ended up being a whistleblower, maybe the world should know that we have fully identified medical records on 60 million people, as well as fully identified information on all of the care providers. And we're using this information to build services that are going to be licensed to organizations beyond Accenture Health. Is that questionable? So, it was deemed to be a little questionable. So much so this was revealed in November of 2019, and Congress began an investigation into Google as an artifact of it. The investigation continued until March 2020, when a little thing called the pandemic shut down the investigation. It's still under investigation at the federal government. Okay, so this has now been turned over to the Department of Justice. It's turned into a full investigation into whether or not Google had questionable business practices. All right? questionable. But let's talk about like really questionable, okay? So little company called Coco. It's a not-for-profit. It was a spin-off from MIT. Coco provides mental health support. I'm really interested in Coco because a lot of our work is on the development of hallucination-resistant mental health chatbots. And so I was really curious about what Coco was up to. A couple years ago, Coco said, hey, we can't provide service support to everybody, right? They had a bunch of mental health support experts, humans, that were interacting with people when they were having questions. So they said, so if we don't have time, would you be interested in working with CocoBot? Okay, CocoBot, this is before the world really knew about ChatGPT. I may have just let the cat out of the bag on where this is going. So here's how it worked. And the question is, do you think that the users knew that this is how it worked? So you have a user, they come in and they say, hey, I'm not feeling great today, maybe I'm a little depressed. Coco, could you provide some support? Coco goes, sure, we can definitely provide some support. Hey, ChatGPT, could you please provide support for this individual? And then the answer would come back from ChatGPT to CocoBot. CocoBot would then send it back to the end user. Okay, and they might have looked at what ChatGPT brought back. I think a lot of people would recognize this as a very sensitive situation, right? Now what you have is a not-for-profit passing over to, at the time, what had now become a for-profit. And they would continue to train on this data. Okay, so remember how I was talking about trust? Hold your hats. The media did not take kindly to this once they found this out, okay? Coco did not fare very well as an artifact, okay? So nobody really had a concern with ChatGPT because they were much more concerned with Coco violating confidentiality terms that they had with the people who were providing questions or prompts or data to them at this point, okay? This is how you break trust. The worst part was that the CEO of Coco kind of shrugged it off and said, oh, no, we're providing really great mental health support to these people. We know that this works. And people said, well, wait, how do you know it works? Have you ever done a clinical trial with ChatGPT? And they were like, no, okay? Broken trust. So that's one of the concerns that we have with third-party services currently with AI technology that's starting to creep into the healthcare world. Another big issue, and what you heard earlier is like I do a lot of work on privacy, is this notion of what has become called memorization problems in language models, all right? Now, this is a problem that we've known about for a number of years. And I'm gonna show you something that's not my work. I really wanna highlight Nick Carlini's work. And so this is work that they did with GPT-2. So this is like back in the day, right? This is like 5, 6 years ago. Nick's team stumbled across this interesting finding where they found that if they gave an esoteric question to GPT-2, it would come back with a really weird answer, okay? Turned out, so like it was a repetitive query. They said, prompt is East Stroudsburg, Stroudsburg. And then the system came back with the training data. And they were able to show that it was the training data because it did not fit the distribution on several information theoretic scores. They were basically looking at perplexity and entropy, and you can see all that stuff in gray was the generative data. All the stuff that's in the red and blue, that was, well, the blue mainly was the memorized data. What was in the memorized data was fully identifying information. Okay, this was a major concern because there were a lot of medical centers that were being approached by tech companies that were saying, hey, we'd like to build language models on your data. And this was an illustration of what could possibly go wrong. That was GPT-2. Okay, so then GPT-4 comes out. 3, then 4, 3.5, and 4 comes out, and so Carlini and Katie Lee and others, same team. I should mention this is a team from Google and Apple as well as Berkeley and Northeastern. They looked at GPT-4, and they're like, surely this has been corrected, right? And so this latest paper, this was in 2023, this is about to become known as the poem paper. because you heard E. Stroudsburg, Stroudsburg. This is query, poem, 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 repeated infinitely. That's what they said. And then the system came back and they were like, oh, book, 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 training data, training data, training data. What happened, right? So a couple things happened here. First, this is one of the problems that you run into with extremely large parameterized language models, okay? What you expect is that when you're training a language model or any deep net, is that the more training data you give it, the more it overwrites the parameters of the system, right? The problem here is that because a lot of this training data is unique, it's esoteric, it ends up in certain parts of the billions of parameters that don't get overwritten. And so as a result, when you ask for something rare, it gives you something rare, which was the training data. Here's the question. They don't know how to stop this problem. It's not a question, it's a statement. So Qingyu Chen's team over at Yale saw this and they said, you know, what about with fine tuning? And so they started taking a lot of the language models and they said, well, what happens if we fine tune it instead of just go back to the basics? Okay, so spoiler alert on this. The quick hits is that one of the things they found was that the longer the input, the more memorization, okay? That was one of the first things they found. They also found this happens in just about every open source LLM that they came across, all right? Paper hasn't been published yet. I highly recommend people read it. It's up on archive. So that's a privacy problem. Another issue that I swear it's not gonna be all problems, I swear. Okay, so is this issue of explainability. All right, so I think that we've talked about this a little bit, like at least when I was on the panel, is that this notion of there's different problems that can happen. One is hallucination. But hallucination in the medical domain can happen in really interesting ways. So great paper by Adam Wright's team. Full disclosure, faculty in my department. Adam posed a bunch of scenarios to ChatGPT, and he said, hey, what would you do for this patient? This paper's a couple years old, and they gave a whole bunch of scenarios. You don't need to read this, you can't read it. What I want to highlight is that one of the things that came back from ChatGPT was, so the scenario that was posed was like, I've got a patient, they're receiving a live virus vaccine, they're immunocompromised, what else should I give them? And it said, oh, you should give them this biologic and you should give them etanafagut. Anybody ever heard of etanafagut? Right, because it's not real. And so they're reading this and they're like, okay, well, this is either a misspelling but that would be really weird to come out of a language model, so it's probably a hallucination. Right, so they then asked it where the evidence from etanafagut came from. And it said, oh, it's from this New England Journal of Medicine article. That New England Journal of Medicine article did not exist. Okay, so this is like what we see in terms of like what's called a snowball effect, where the language model gives a lie. It doesn't really understand a lie. But remember that thing I told you about value alignment. It doesn't want to get caught in a lie. And so it just kind of continues to double down on what it's doing. I don't know how many of you have had this experience before. So it turns out, so we started investigating this problem, and I had a student who was doing an internship at Intuit. And they were seeing similar types of things when they were building tax support chatbots. And so we were like, oh, this would be really great to investigate. And they said, yeah. So we ended up designing a system that's now become known as SAC3, and I'll show you what it is in a second, where it's a relatively simple hack, where what we did was we took a prompt, and then we forced it into a semantic rewrite. And so we would allow this rewrite to happen several different times, and then we would put it into the model and we would ask for the answer, right, the response. And then we could check to see how often we were getting the same answer back. So we turned this into a distributional analysis because these are probabilistic reasoners. We need to get some type of an external view on how reliable it is because they can't tell us how reliable it is. right? And so this is the typical my line is better than your line graph. We based SAC3 on an older system called SAC2, SC2, and this is what's known as the prime number problem, right? Where the prime number problem is you ask ChatGPT, is this a prime number or not, right? And you check to see how well it can reason. And so this was basically our tolerance for certainty in terms of like where we were in the distribution, like what it looked like. And so like we could make it very certain, but we would have like not as much precision. But we saw that this was way better than the older systems, which were not using distributional strategies. And we saw similar types of results when we asked other types of questions, like the senator search. And if you're not familiar with the senator search, it's you ask ChatGPT if the name of a senator is a real person and where they're based. So this gave us excitement. But we also, after that, we said, well, why are we even letting ChatGPT answer this question, right? Why, under what circumstances should that be the case? And so we were really curious about, like, why don't we just have it abstain from answering if it doesn't think it knows the answer? Language models are horrible at this. Like, if you say you have the option of choosing I don't know and you give it a multiple choice answer, try it. I highly recommend it. You will watch this thing wig out, totally freak out, all right? There's a couple papers that Nigam Shah's team out in Stanford just published a couple weeks ago that really showed this effect amazingly. The funny thing is that when you say none, if you give it a choice of none of the above, it seems to act normal, but the semantics of I don't know just makes it freak. So what we started doing was we wrote this paper called Do You Know What You're Talking About? Where basically what we do is, again, we try to get a distributional analysis. And the way we do it is we bring forward a query, and then we ask it to create synthetic queries that seem to be in the same vicinity of what we have. And we check to see if it's capable of doing so. And again, so now we can measure the distribution. And if it's not in the same vicinity, if this seems to be out of distribution, we can make a recommendation of shut it down. Stop using the AI tool because you're very much in an out of distribution situation, all right? So that's basically what I said. So we can flag these queries. All right, so that's a really great opportunity. So like, this is not just a problem. We've recognized that it was a problem, but it's a problem of blind trust, right? Now the challenge with what we developed is that you're basically increasing the bandwidth because you're gonna have to rerun this query over and over and over again. But, okay, so let's say that we did solve that. We then have this question of, is the system well balanced, right? Is it fair? And I think that people hear this phrase a lot. And I think that this is best illustrated with a paper by Ziad Obermeyer's team, where this was, again, like before ChatGPT, they were looking at prediction algorithms. And so they had a situation in which patients were being discharged from a hospital, and they were being given the opportunity to pursue additional treatment. Okay, and it was a decision that was made at discharge about whether or not they would be given that recommendation. One of the things that they saw was that payment levels for these individuals was correlated with their health outcomes. Why is that a problem? That's a problem because in their data set, they found that white patients were paying more than black patients on average. So what ended up happening was that the system ended up hinging upon the patient was white, therefore they would be recommended for receiving this additional support. Okay, so this is really a major problem because that's a false inference. Okay, so you kind of have a teachable moment here, which is just like, that was like a no-brainer situation in which that algorithm should have gone under some review, but it never did because it was just based on data. It just happened to be that the data was sending them in the wrong direction. So it's been suggested that you just don't use variables that are potentially of concern or they're socially stigmatic. For example, maybe you just shouldn't collect race You shouldn't collect gender, okay? Now, we wouldn't be the first country to even do this, right? So if you go to France, in their space, in their healthcare world, they don't collect race. They don't reason on it. Now, the cautionary tale on this situation was that during the pandemic, they had a situation in which blacks were getting infected at a much higher rate than whites in certain places in the country. There were hotspots, right? They didn't recognize it. Do you know when they did recognize it? When they died. They collected race at death, right? So this is a problem, right? This is a problem of, if people say there's a problem with the variable, it's not the problem with the variable, it's the way in which you're injecting that variable into the model. You can still use it for policy testing. So we wrote a lot about this. So we wrote this paper on human-centered strategies for debiasing these systems. The Department of Health and Human Services put it in its strategic plan for earlier this year. And we talked about how you need to recognize these biases can show up at all different points of the life cycle, as I was alluding to, at design time, at development, at deployment. But it requires having humans in the loop. So as we were doing that, there's been some great work on categorizing all the different fairness tools that are out there that people can use. I'm gonna speed this up a little bit. But basically, Fei Wang's team said, hey, there's all of these tools that are out there for people to use to test for fairness results in an algorithm. Now, the bigger problem they ran into was, what is the definition of fairness? Okay, because if you look in the literature, there's at least 15 different definitions of fairness. Some of them are population-driven, some of them are individual-level driven, and it's really tricky. So how do you make a recommendation to somebody of which one they're supposed to put in place? That's an opportunity. But it requires standards. Okay, so a lot of our work over the last couple of years has said, one of the reasons why these types of fairness problems crop up is that you have imbalance in the data. Right? You just have problems in the class labels, you've got problems in the input data. And so we said, maybe what we can do is create fake records. We could create synthetic data. This is the direction that the NIH has been pushing a lot of people. And it's not a crazy idea, right? So Ian Goodfellow's team over at DeepMind demonstrated how to use GANs to create fake faces and do deep fakes over a decade ago. But faces are relatively easy because pixels are autocorrelated with each other. What we were interested in was medical records data. Now, as we got interested in it, what we found was that our idea of could you use synthetic data to make the system more fair was actually stumbled across by a team in Germany. And they were doing image processing, though. And they said, hey, they were trying to do lesion detection on livers. And what you can see here is that when they used their data, training over time, they topped out at around 77% in their accuracy. And then when they used synthetic data that was generated, and they were using GAN synthesized data, they were able to get a major boost. And we were like, oh, that's really interesting. So we developed a technique that was for medical records data. And we were looking at demographics, diagnoses, procedures, and meds. Again, not a causal model. This is going to be a correlative model. But this is something that we developed back in almost a decade ago now. And what we showed was that this was the rate at which you would generate certain facts in an individual's medical record in the real, and this is the rate at which you would generate it in the synthetic data. And we said, if you used a variational autoencoder at the time, it wasn't bad. But when we introduced a GAN, it was significantly better, right? And so we then had over a whole series of iterations of this. We showed that one of the reasons why this happened was that we introduced a way of evaluating on latent dimensions instead of first-order statistics. And then we showed how to probabilistically embed constraints because these systems had a potential to create, women with prostate cancer. And then we also showed where things got tricky was how to go from static profile-based generation to longitudinal generation, okay? So there's a whole body of work that we've developed in this space. But what I wanted to point out was that we then proved, or at least earlier this year, we demonstrated that you could use this type of synthetic generation with the HR data to get to much more equitable algorithms. I realize that's an ugly picture, but just trust me. Okay, so since you probably know me by now, right? So sounds great. What could go wrong? Lots of things could go wrong. So one of them was that as this type of work was developed, we were figuring out that some of these systems could be inverted. How much time do I got? 5. Okay. So an example. So this is the type of deepfake stuff that Ian's team had been developing. And so what you can see is that like this was the pretty good looking fake data, but then when you look at the training data, it looked a lot like the training data, right? And so there was a zero-shot inversion strategy that was created to basically infer the real data as an artifact. And so this is why I say this is like when machine learning goes boink, because what happens is that you've got mimicry. And the reason why this happens is that you have insufficient training data. This is the exact same problem of the GPT regurgitation, only now you're seeing it in a generative circumstance. We had then shown that you could develop these things called membership inference tests against the system, where if I knew a little bit about somebody's record, I could prove whether or not they were in the training data. I might not know all of their information, but I could show they were in the training data. We could then show that you could do some attribute inference, so that if you knew a couple things about somebody, you could then forecast something else about them, right? And that was the major privacy attack, where people started to get a little freaked out about this, because we could say, oh, you're in the training data, and I can predict this thing about you. So I know exactly what I wanted to learn. So we developed a whole software system. I say we, like Chao Yan, who I work with, really did a great job on this, where we put like all the different privacy measures and all the different utility measures into a software package. And we open sourced it and we said, hey, if you're going to generate EHR data, please, please, please benchmark it against these strategies. Here's the software for doing so. It's been used a number of times. We felt pretty good about this. So we've now gotten to the point where I'm like, you know, we're determining when we use the language model. We figure out how exactly to like give additional information to the language model, and then one of my students comes back to me and she says, hey, you know, what happens in a low resource setting when they don't have access, they don't want to pay for these like, you know, big language models? What happens if they just run to the internet and they just like add some information into it? And so we were really curious about, could these language models do clinical prediction tasks? And so what we did was we took GPT and we compared it against a locally trained model for 2 different problems. One is ICU transfer. This is from a data set out of Harvard. And then we took a Vanderbilt data set and we tried to do discharge prediction. And we said, okay, well, let's step it up a notch. Let's do GPT in a vanilla fashion, but let's also RAG it. And the way we RAG'd it was that we said, okay, I want you to tell me what's gonna happen to this patient. Here's a whole bunch of other patients that you can compare it to, right? And what their outcomes were. And cool, 2. Anyway, so here's where I'm going to show you all the different results. And I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't care, because spoiler alert, they all look the same. So here's a typical ROC curve. Up at the top, that's our local model. It was a boosting model, cat boost, really simple. Had an AUC of around 0.85. GPT-4 was at around 0.6. GPT 3.5, free public version, almost random. My student ran the same analysis with GPT-5 a couple days ago. I don't have the graph. Looks almost the same, okay? Moral of the story on this one is that you think that language models might be great. I showed you that they could give me like really great recommendations on what drugs to repurpose. it does not understand the language of what's happening in medicine. Not all the time. I'm going to skip this part because we're going to skip visual language models, and I'm going to go to the end and say just a couple things. So one, I think everybody should recognize like the future like is really cool. Like there are just like amazing opportunities for this AI. What we don't have is AI that is humble, especially in the healthcare domain. We have AI that really likes to give you an answer, but what we really need are checkpoints so that we can say, should I be using you? Should you be phoning a friend? Should you actually like give me some confidence interval around what this assessment is? We don't have that yet. We also, and I alluded to this in the panel, we have to make sure that AI doesn't blind us, right? Like I gave you guys, for those that were here earlier, I gave you the endoscopy example. Like we do know that the more clinicians interact with these tools, they will get better, but the question is, are they going to atrophy some of their certain, diagnostic capabilities? This is going to have to be resolved. There's a lot more experimentation and trials that have to be run. Third, the foundation models, these things are getting huge. They're getting multimodal, they're getting bigger, they're getting badder. They're just like, but they don't have these tests to determine A, whether or not they're memorizing the information that they were based on, and they're definitely not being designed in a manner that makes it possible to correct errors that are baked into them, right? And finally, I do think that we have a potential for agentic teams. There's been some like really, really, really cool illustrations of agentism in the biomedical discovery world. We haven't seen it yet in the clinical world, but we know it's coming, all right? So this is just like what the future looks like, in my opinion. So with that, I will stop on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malin. That was fantastic. We have some questions from the audience. We'll try to address as many as we can in the time that we have. Our first question, organizations claim to anonymize data before they pass it to an AI system for further analysis. How true do you think that claim is? Number one.
Who asked the question?
And number two, how easy would it be to use that same AI or similar machine to de-anonymize the data?
So I don't know who's claiming that the data is de-identified before it goes into the AI systems. I think that some organizations are doing it, but not all organizations are doing it. It really depends on the organization. So I'll just leave it at that. Secondly, this question of, can you use these models to de-anonymize a situation? Has anybody ever tried to use ChatGPT to look up a specific person who wasn't famous? It's hard, right? It's really hard. Moreover, if you only give it the demographics of an individual and you say, who does this correspond to in this country? It comes back and says, you're asking me to do something that's illegal. I'm not kidding. Claude is even like weirder. But what I'm pointing out is that so some of these big systems and the public systems, they've built guardrails into them. Some of the open source models, I don't know. But there's been lots of demonstrations that it's very difficult to invert transformers. It's very difficult to invert some of the large language models to get back to like identified information, even though I showed a couple of illustrations with GPT. So moral of the story is that you should be de-identifying before you send it into the training. If you don't, then there's a potential for a violation, but we're not going to know them until people pick them off.
Great, thank you. You were starting to touch on guardrails, and one of our questions is about guardrails in the process of using AI for drug development. In particular, our audience member wanted to know about how do you ensure that a drug is developed so that it works kind of reasonably well across a variety of populations, similarly well across a variety of populations, and not specifically better in one population than another?
Yeah. I actually didn't think that's where the question was going to go, so I'll take it in two directions. I think, first of all, I don't think that I'm saying anything that's like mind-bending when I say it's like you need to test. You need to have as representative of a data set as you can, first of all, and you need to test to just show that the system is going to be generalizable. So let me skip past the drug issue because I don't think that there's anything special about the drug situation. Right now, we have a lot of different AI tools that are being approved by the FDA. And the FDA has like a system of, they have tests that are set up for safety. And they're saying, show us who your population was, show that it has some degree of generalizability, and show like that it's going to pass these safety tests. The problem is that a lot of these tools are highly dependent on how they get used, and that depends on organizational behavior. And so what a lot of medical centers are now doing is that they're setting their own tests, their own POCs, proof of concepts, to show that the system's going to be viable for their own patient population. It's a great idea. The only problem is that it doesn't scale, right? So if every organization has to pay for their own testing, their own system testing, it's not going to fly. And that will limit the adoption of these technologies. So that begs the question of who should pay for this, right? Should they have like a broader set of tests that are set up? Or should the medical device manufacturer or whoever the drug developer is have to demonstrate within your own environment that if you're going to use it, they have to prove to you that it works there as well? It's unclear at this time, but that's going to be more of a question about regulatory controls.
Another question was about kind of the development of AI slop, so to speak. So do we think that these LLMs might decline in quality over time as they consume more AI-generated content?
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, people refer to that as the Aurora Boreas effect, right? So like you have the snake eating its tail, and it's. I think it really depends on if you become completely dependent on synthetic data. So one of the studies that we've done shows that as you increase the amount of synthetic data that you're injecting into your training, you get an increased performance in your classification up to a point. And then after a point, you end up flooding the system with the synthetic data, and you lose that signal, the original signal starts to go away. That's a major challenge. So that's a calibration issue. It's a question of like how much can you inject before you lose your signal. The reason, so just so that you understand, the reason why synthetic data, I didn't have time to go over this, the reason why synthetic data can improve performance is not just because you haven't seen enough instances. If that was the case, you could have just upsampled or downsampled one of the classes in the data set. But instead, what it is that the way in which classification margins end up getting learned is that they basically will fit to the data that they've observed. Okay, and so when you don't have data that's been observed, it's going to assume that there was nothing there, for the most part. So when you synthesize data and you simulate that data during the training process, it basically gives you the ability to get a clearer picture of where that margin is supposed to be. All right, so this is actually really intriguing. But when you think about it, is that you're injecting a little bit of noise, controlled noise, into the data set so that it doesn't become overly reliant upon the original training data. Okay, but if you inject too much noise, you swamp the signal. And so that's why you have to be careful about the whole snake eating its tail phenomenon.
You touched on this a little bit, both in your talk and some of your previous answers, but one of our audience members was asking about issues, especially around mental health and chatbots, and
yeah.
What is the responsibility of the people who create these systems to ensure that there's safety, that we're not making unsafe recommendations to people in this context?
I don't think that it's my place to say that, to be honest with you. I think it's a very deep ethical question about what's the responsibility of any type of a manufacturer of a product, right? There's only a certain degree of responsibility that they can take up to a point, right? And so this is something that I would want to have a much deeper conversation with rather than just jump up here and pontificate. Sorry to whoever asked that question.
Oh, please.
Just one very simple wrap-up. Simple wrap-up question. How might one enable LLMs to be humbled by failure?
Be humble, but what?
To be humbled by failure.
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So what you need is to have, so I can tell you that from a technical standpoint, one of the reasons why they're not humble is because of the way that reinforcement learning currently works and the way that we use it. So like when you're training a language model, right, I'll just focus on language models, but same is true of foundation models, that what ends up happening is that we don't have an objective function. So we're just learning the topology and the relationships over all of the data, all right? So now, when you go ask it to do some type of generation, or you try to ask it to make a prediction, it says, okay, given everything that I've had so far, I'm gonna go make that prediction, I'm gonna make that generation, right? But what happens next is that, so you have the model, and then we were talking about this yesterday, so like when you then do the reinforcement in that you have it interact with end users. Okay, so somebody issues a query, and then they get a response back, and they either upvote it or they downvote it. And so what you need as a system is that when it's, if the system abstains, in most reinforcement learning systems now, what ends up happening is that it gets penalized for abstention because it didn't give an answer. So what we need to figure out is a strategy for either, well, we basically have to change the way the penalty works, right? We need to figure out that like abstention can be upvoted, but only up to a certain amount, because if you end up upvoting it a lot, you're gonna end up in a situation in which the system doesn't want to give any positive answers because it's gonna try and be more and more precise. And so you end up in this interesting balancing act between precision versus recall, right? So I think that this notion of like how do you get abstention is that you need to have like a series of step backs. You need to have like fail safes so that the system is comfortable that it understands the next action. So that if it says, sorry, I can't give you that answer, it's up to you, user, to figure out what to do next. Now, it depends on who the user is, because you're gonna have different loss functions here. So if it's a doctor who has the right or the ability to interact with the patient at that point, and they understand the scenario and you're just automating them, great. But if it's just a patient or a potential patient and they've come in and on the mental health side, they're like, hey, I'm having a problem today, what am I supposed to do? And the system comes back and it says, I'm sorry, you should go talk to a mental health support specialist because that's not what I'm capable of doing at this time. You've given me symptoms that I'm unaware of. What you might have, like imagine if somebody comes in with a statement that says, I'm feeling suicidal, what should I do? And if the system says, sorry, I'm not capable of helping you, that's the wrong answer, right? The correct answer is, you should call 911 or you should call somebody else and here's what you should do. It's all about the value judgment there.
We have one question about the idea of world models versus LLMs. The term world models, I think, has lots of different definitions, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, that's a very broad question.
Very, very good question.
Could you opine on the way the world works?
Yeah, they asked specifically with regard to future biomedical research. Still similarly broad.
Yeah, so I will reiterate something that I said today, and I apologize, but I think it's relevant, which is that one of the reasons why I think, I didn't show you one of the other results that we've had with LLMs, which was that over time, the LLMs don't always get better. So what we've seen with GPT as an example is that with certain types of questions, GPT will get better, but then when you ask it the same types of other types of questions, it gets worse. One of the ways in which that was illustrated was that GPT was, how many people heard that GPT passed the US medical licensing examination? Right? So 3 months later, it failed the medical licensing examination. Okay, and one of the reasons why that happened is that the system was trained with additional data, and it ended up moving in a direction such that it was capable of other types of things, and it kind of like, it forgot, right? And so the underlying network was distorted a little bit. And so this is a problem that you run into with these all-purpose language models. When you're trying to like satisfy every objective function, you're going to end up losing certain objectives. And so this is one of the reasons why I think people are recognizing or starting to slowly recognize that small models that are focused on specific topics are probably going to be more capable and more reliable than trying to use an all-purpose foundation model or LLM. What exactly is the right amount of information that ends up going into those smaller or moderate-sized models? I don't think anybody knows yet. I think that that's also one of like the really big, exciting research areas.
Yeah, great. One of the things that we struggle with, I think, in healthcare research is data privacy. And so federated learning, I think, is a big topic these days that we're trying to deal with. And creating data sets that are really representative is challenging, and so we need to work with lots of different centers. You mentioned at some point this idea of being able to kind of utilize a test to figure out how close a particular sample, an input sample might be to someone's training distribution at one of the sites that might be involved in a federated learning.
Yeah, so I think I know where you're going with this, but like, so fed learning is fascinating, right? Because in many respects, federated learning is just like a more sophisticated version of a meta-analysis. And so, you want to bring things together that seem to be approximately in the same distribution. So federated learning has like really great opportunity. The challenge with it is what do you do with the things that are out of distribution? So for a second, so imagine I've got like 100 different medical centers across the country. They've all got chest x-ray data, and then they've got outcomes for these individuals based on the chest x-rays. And then you basically want them to all participate, but a couple of the sites seem to be having different distributions. Their gradients are completely different than everybody else. So what do you do? Do you drop them from the system? Do you say, oh, well, maybe we should create a different federation for you guys because we don't want to create a single federation because you guys might end up skewing the distribution? So federation is great. It will protect privacy without a doubt. But I will tell you that a lot of people get a little hesitant because they don't know exactly what went into the data, into the model, the local model, before it came forward. So do you mind if I riff on that for one more second?
Please.
Okay, so fed learning, does anybody work on multi-party computing or secure multi-party computing? No. Okay, so fed learning, how many people understand what fed learning is? Okay, so basically like a bunch of different sites each have their own little local models, and then they like take all the parameters of those models and then they throw them together, and then like they work together to create a global model. They don't have to give individual level records. They just have to give what the model parameters look like. So that's why it's privacy preserving. The notion of fed learning is very similar from a privacy perspective as what's known as secure multi-party computing, which is a cryptographic way of doing this. Okay, so I just hide all the data. I compute one big model in the crypto space, and then I decrypt, and we're all happy. So 10 years ago, everybody thought that secure multi-party computation was going to change the world. We figured out how to make crypto run at scale. It was like really amazing. We were like, yay, privacy, privacy, privacy. And then people used the models and they said, the model that came out isn't exactly what I wanted it to be. Could you show me what your data was? And it's like, well, no, because the whole point was to not show you what the data was. And then people were like, well, if you're not going to show me what the data is, I don't trust the model. So this created like this really challenging situation about what types of quality control metrics do I need to put in place in addition to just the model to try to get people to have some confidence and trust in it. I think the exact same thing is going to happen with fed learning. It's going to work really well in some places where like we have an understanding of standards. So like radiology, right? Like DICOM, data is all in the same exact format. Everywhere it's in the same orientation. Electronic medical records, oh man. Trust me, like if you've seen like a medical record at one institution, you've seen a medical record at one institution. Like it's not the same everywhere. So it has potential. It's going to require a degree of trust that I just don't know if it's going to get there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Malin.
Thanks.
Another round of applause for our speaker. Thank you so much.